Hello, this is rStoryBites and we'll be covering the subreddit, rNuclearRevenge. Insult me in front of my staff, say goodbye to your family's political career. This is my first post on Reddit, so please bear with English as it's not my first language. Note 1, names, characters, and places are changed for privacy reasons. Note 2, this is a revenge story of my father, not mine, and was told to me by Dad's friend, Rob. Note 3, this story took place in the late 1990s to early 2000s. Note 4, I will be using US dollars instead of my country's currency, which is way lower than USD. Note 5, it's a long story, so bear with me on that. TD, LR at the end. Names. My father, Dad. Politician, Jack. Politician's brother-in-law, Bill. Bill's consultant, Dave. Dad's friend, Rob. Background, I live in an economically developing nation, used to be heavily dependent on agriculture produced for economic activity. My grandfather was a farmer and he wanted his children to get educated and get a government job. So my dad got his master's from the only university we had in our region. Since most people study from the same university and get government jobs, so everyone in government offices knew one another in some way or the other. My dad was offered the position of officer in charge of our home state for the agriculture department and had around 40 people working under him. His task was to take care of agriculture and its related activities and acted as advisor to the local farming community via local newspapers. During the 1980s and early 1990s, our country had long droughts and famines. The then government decided to create two different government agencies to take care of food security. One agency will take care of buying and storing food grains, and another agency was tasked to enable building the infrastructure for food security. Dad was attached to the agency which was tasked with infrastructure. His agency's job was to give grants for anyone building infrastructure for food security. His duty was given the task of providing grants to anyone who is building warehouses for storing food. His job was to review the entire warehouse from planning to construction that can store food and provide a third of project cost as a grant subsidy to people who built it. This was the time when my country was doing all the stuff on paper, no computers, only typewriters, in government offices and no cell phone. Your options were limited to a fixed telephone line and fax copying machines, which were mind-blowing technology for my dad, were new to government offices. My dad used to do tons of paperwork in the office, reading through stuff, adding remarks, writing stuff. Add to that you had postal service that took somewhere between 7-10 days to have your mail delivered to the nearest town or city. Yeah, those were the times my dad lived. The story. In the late 1990s, my dad was doing his work at his office. When a commotion at the office entrance gets my dad's attention, he sees from the office window where 10 expensive cars are parked and a group of thugs holding the collar security personnel while warning them with long sticks and knives. My country didn't have armed security for government building back then. Security folks usually had small sticks. There were several unauthorized people were entering the building. You see, people were not allowed inside any government office unless they state the purpose to the officer in charge and the officer permits the security to allow them. Suddenly Bill and his men walk into my dad's office, pushing my dad's staff away. Bill introduces himself and mentions that he is the brother-in-law of Jack, the senator from our region, and calls himself one of the powerful people in the region. He sits in my dad's chair and then drinks coffee and eats the cookies that were ordered for my dad, which was kept on his desk. Bill informs his men to go easy on my dad's staff as they start to drink coffee and eat cookies that were meant for the employees. Bill tells my dad that he was there to discuss availing the grant the government provides for a project that he was planning. My dad at times is submissive to people in the position of power as he has seen consequences firsthand as some of his friends lost jobs or lives standing against powerful people. So Dad asks for the details of the project Bill was planning and asks him to send over the project proposal and an official request for the grant to him for reviewing, and informed Bill that the grant cannot be processed until the project is completed. Bill gets angry that any proposal for the project is enough to qualify for a grant and should be paid up front for the project construction. My dad tells him how grant works and the project should be completed in order to qualify for the grant. Bill, pissed by this point, and yells at my dad and his office staff how government officials or educated morons are running the country into the grave. Bill takes all the necessary forms and applications from my dad and leaves the office furiously. Since no incidents happen and my dad didn't bother much about the incident. Few weeks go by and my dad receives a huge set of documents via the postal service, and you might have guessed it, those documents were related to Bill's project. Going through those documents, my dad identifies that they came from Dave, a consultant who was doing the work on behalf of Bill, and the documents further reveal that warehouse proposed in the region was big enough to hold enough food grains to feed a population equivalent for 2 states for an entire year. The proposed project would cost them $1.5 billion, and once completed it would cost the government $300 million in the grant. This was a huge amount for Dad to handle. Till that time, largest project he ever reviewed for providing government grant was $50K. That's total project cost, not the grant. Building such infrastructure would mean that any other warehouse existing to be built in the region would be rendered useless. He quickly called his boss asking him what he was supposed to do. His boss quickly looks at the rules and tells my dad that since there was no upper limit on the size of the warehouse or project cost, the only thing they could do was to review and process the application, and if everything checks out they might end up with $300 million in grant money. Since his boss okayed processing of the application, my dad further reviewed the project proposal to identify that the warehouse was specifically designed for industrial use and not for storing food grains. Dad was confused, so he gives a call to Dave. Dave informs my dad that he was hired to plan for a warehouse for industrial and there might have been some confusion over the details, and Dave promises that he would fix it and not reject the application based on those terms. Unsure of details, he decides to process the application and sends a note to Dave that the government would be reviewing the application, and once the project is completed he should be informed about project completion, and my dad would visit the premises and give final approval after reviewing, and it would take another 3-6 months time get grant money as a check from the government after the review process is done. 2 years go by. Dave comes to my dad's office in an expensive luxury SUV and dares the security personnel to stop him if they want to keep their job. Dave then rushes to my dad's cabin and asks my dad if he was available on that day to visit the premises and give final approval for the project. Unsure who Dave was and asks for clarification and why he would need to do approval today. Dad also informs Dave that there is a lot of documentation work that he needs to prepare before visiting the warehouse to give final approval. That would take at least 2 days for my dad. Dave tries to reason with my dad that he came from far-off city and he couldn't stay for long to get this completed. My dad again tells Dave that 2 days is the minimum it would take him to documentation ready. Dave, now angry, informs my dad that he represents Bill and Jack and the warehouse needs to be inspected today or lose his job. Dad was not buying it, told him again 2 days or forget it. Dave leaves the office warning my dad that he will face consequences. Dad calls his boss informing him what had happened, and the boss tells my dad to take priority and inspect the warehouse at the earliest. 2 days later, my visits the warehouse and to his surprise, he sees Dave on location. The first thing my dad noticed about the warehouse was it was not built for food grains or any agricultural produce for that matter. It was built for industrial purposes. Dave gives my dad a tour of the entire warehouse, explaining to him how state-of-the-art it was for the time. My dad takes note of every detail of the warehouse and informs Dave that the grant can't be approved due to fact that the warehouse was not constructed with storing agricultural produce in mind, and no one with a sound mind would overlook that fact. To approve the grant, Dave starts yelling and excusing my father that he was looking for a bribe by withholding their grant, and my dad would approve the grant once he gets paid off. Bill and Jack are being targeted for making money off them. None of that was true about my dad. He was an honest man his entire life. My dad leaves the warehouse unsure of what he could do get out of this situation. The next, my dad, who was super confused about why Bill has built an industrial warehouse in the middle of nowhere and only the major activity in the region was farming. So he decides to call up Rob and asks him a few questions about how Rob's government agency, construction and building permits, has provided. Rob takes a couple of days to identify some horrific realities. First, the plans of the warehouse showcase and request permit to be an industrial complex for storing manufacturing goods. Bill bribed his way through Rob's agency and got environmental clearance and other permits without conforming to standards. He was also able to identify a report for building completion that was forwarded agency's requests for considering for storing food grains. Last but not least, he was able to find a construction tax bill submitted to the agency stating the construction cost of the warehouse is around $300 million, along with plans of creating an industrial zone for the region that was proposed to the Senate by Jack. This was news to my dad and Rob. They were shocked to know how Bill and Dave were able to inflate the cost of the warehouse, and they had plans to make the region a new industrial zone. My dad calls his boss and informs that Bill's project seems fishy and he would reject the grant and forwarding him the documents once done. His boss tries to reason with him it could be a career-ending move for both of them. Jack was trying to put pressure from the leader of the agency to have the grant approved. Rob decides to dig around to see if he can get any more information and found the contract paper that was sent to the Food Procurement and Storing Agency, which raised several red flags. First, the contract stated an inflated rent for storing food grains. Then rent will be reviewed on a yearly basis based on market rate, and then the contract would make the agency pay for the next 15 years irrespective of whether the agency stores food or not. Rob calls my dad with this information. Now my dad, furious to know how Bill and Jack are planning to rob the government, decides to reject the grant for their project. A few days later, Bill turns up at my dad's office along with Dave in the same bashful manner he previously did, but now even more furious asks my dad why he is not approving the grant for his project and why it's taking so much time. Dad tries to calmly reason with him, stating it was not built as per norms, so he won't be able to approve. Bill turns red and fuming with anger. He can't throw around as much money. My dad wanted to have his signature on the documents approving the grant. My dad refuses that it's a crime to bribe an officer. Bill goes on telling my dad that he lives in a mansion filled with escort girls and have as many as he likes. Dad refuses again. Bill now threatens my dad, saying he could get out of his job and replace someone else in the same position can do the job for him. Again, my dad firmly tells Bill that he can do whatever the hell he wants to do, but my dad would not approve the grant. This goes as a shouting match for around 3 hours in front of the entire office staff, but my dad didn't budge. Bill starts swearing to my father, telling him that he impotent to pass up an offer of having sex with the cheapest escort girls Bill has, which would cost my dad his entire year's salary to hire such an escort for a day. He also goes on yelling how my dad's parents might have abandoned him as a child who refuses to bring fortune to his family. My dad had enough of Bill by this point and asks Bill leaves his office. In the last attempt to threaten my dad, Bill asks his thugs to take care of him and leaves the office along with Dave. Bill's thugs threatened my dad at knife point, stating he needs to sign those papers, otherwise he would end up dead in a pile of rotten garbage. He also tells him that they wait for 1 month and expect those papers signed after that. Thugs then go on to ransack the entire office before leaving and also threaten the staff to make sure his boss sign those damn papers approving the grant. My dad calls Rob and informs him what had happened and asks him fax all the documents collected so far WRT Bill's project, and he would be asking for those documents officially. Rob asks my dad what was his intention of using those documents and his plans were. My dad says I am going to take them down and I had enough from them. Rob tells my dad not to do anything crazy in the heat of the moment, but assured that he would send those details to my dad. The same day, Rob faxed my dad around 2,000 documents. My dad then calls up his boss to inform him that he would be going on a 10-day vacation. By the end of the day, my dad leaves the office with all documents related to Bill's project and fax documents from Rob and head home. For the next 10 days, my dad sits at home going through every document, evidence he gathered with the help of Rob, and drafts his grant rejection letter with a lot of details, as didn't want to leave a chance anyone who can replace him or higher up above him rejecting his comments on the project and approve the grant. After the vacation, goes back to the office and the staff were surprised to him and were thinking that Bill's men abducted him, since he didn't inform anyone about his vacation plans. The same day, my dad asks his assistant to mail the documents to his boss as a confidential report. His assistant takes the documents and heads to the nearest postal office. At the same moment, Bill's men come to my dad's office to check with him if he had signed the documents or not, and he would be in serious trouble if is not done. My dad lies to them that he has approved the grant and his assistant has just gone to mail those documents to his boss for processing and would take up to 3 months for the grant to arrive. My dad also tells them to inform Bill that everything has been taken care of and there is nothing to worry about anymore, so that my dad won't be bothered by Bill or his men any further. A week later, my dad's boss furiously calls and asks my dad about the grant rejection letter he sent him and how crazy my dad was, which could end up having both of them killed. My dad assures his boss that he has taken care of everything, including Bill and Jack, and nothing to worry about, and he has to do is to hold on to those documents for a month or so. A month later, a local newspaper breaks a story of how Jack was corrupt to the hilt and Bill was a partner in his crimes. The same morning, Bill is arrested from his mansion half naked and totally drunk along with a lot of escort girls. Bill was charged with corruption, bribery, sex racketeering, money laundering, and murder. Bill's men were also arrested for murder and were sentenced for life along with Bill. Jack was arrested for corruption, bribery, intimidation, and abuse of power. Jack made bail but never won the election again, eventually retiring from politics. A decade later, Bill testified against Jack for the crimes they both committed and Jack was sentenced to 15 years in jail. Dave was also charged with bribery, forgery, and money laundering. Dave fled the country to escape jail time. No one knows for sure where he is now. Police are still looking for him. No one ever knew how did that happen to Bill and Jake except Rob and my dad. The revenge. You see, my dad took 10 days vacation not just to hide from Bill's men, but he was planning to execute his perfect plan for revenge against Bill. He systematically documented every ounce of evidence he had and drafted a comprehensive report against Bill and Jack on how they planned to cheat the government and have the government cough up the money for nothing. Remember when he asked his assistant to mail the documents to his boss? He actually had mailed 4 copies of those documents. One for his boss for rejection of grant. The second one was to the agency that was planning to store good grain in Bill's warehouse, proposing to blacklist his property for non-compliance with standards. The third and fourth mails were sent as an anonymous tip to a federal agency equivalent of FBI, let's call it XBI, and to an investigative journalist from a local newspaper. XBI was also informed that a copy was sent to the local newspaper. XBI and the investigative journalist did their own investigation and found that the money put into the warehouse project was Jack's entire stash of money what he got through bribes, commissions, and favors for doing things while he was in power. This money was laundered by Bill through a network of entities to find the warehouse project and cook the books to inflate the project cost, get his money back from the government as a grant in legal form. The journalist also uncovered some government officials were murdered by Bill and his men for not doing Bill asked them to do and handed the evidence over to XBI. It took them a month to investigate and identify all the pieces of the puzzle to nab Bill and Jack. Neither XBI nor the journalist was able to find out who sent those documents to them. My dad's boss took early retirement and Dad became the director of the agency he worked for a few years later and eventually retiring 15 years after this incident. Rob retired a year later and narrated this entire story to our family at his retirement party. I still see the abandoned warehouse whenever I travel to my hometown from the city where I work. TD/LR politician's family insults my dad in front of his office staff. Dad takes down their 2-decade political career and put them jail. If there were only more honest men in the world like your father, I'm certain we wouldn't get into 90% of the messes we've been in. You've had a magnificent example. Honest is not enough, you also need balls of steel. The fact that the abandoned warehouse is viewable like a massive monument to your dad's win against corruption makes this far greater. What a man. If this did happen, I fear for your life. I also live in a country where politicians have their own private armies, basically, big security teams armed to the teeth. And there are times, especially after an election, that they are very dangerous, especially if they lost, because a lot of them resort to vote buying, basically paying poor voters money so they get voted. If they lost, they take it out on the people. They are nothing more but criminals engaged in businesses, fattening their bank accounts while they rule the land and the people are kept poor. Thanks for everyone's appreciative comments. As some of you want to guess know the country where this had happened and when. I am worried about the safety of my family as members of Jack's and Bill's family are still an active part of the political scene in my country and still threaten a section of people. And this has been rStoryBites. If you like these entries, please do like and consider subscribing to us and hit that bell notification icon. And we'll see you in the next one.